Welcome, everyone. We would just ask if people would like to partake in the food on the side whenever you're ready. We're going to get started in about 15 minutes, so if you want to grab some food right now, that would be great. Thank you. So in order to be environmentally friendly, we have a limited number of plates. You're welcome to have as much as you like. If you're going to come up for dessert, we ask that you hang on to your plate, please. Thank you.
I don't know. Yeah, sure, great. Be good if it made my hair kind of like, it didn't look like.
It was straight, and I even put oil in it to make it smooth, but
It's probably fine.
it's kind of hitting here.
Well, if any of my mom's PSWs whose calls always go through, call me. That will just be part of life. It'll be a nice teaching moment about.
It'll show up though, right, as a call?
It will ring through even if I have my ringer off. That's what I'm just realizing. But they probably won't. Yeah, that is just life. When they call and I'm in class, I take the call. Yep. Anyway, I have my 4 drinks, so that's excellent.
I'm like that too. I've got 2. I've been worried about spilling because I've only got half a coffee. Should have worn a sweater, I don't think. Real smart short shorts.
You were smart, you wore short sleeves, I wore a sweater.
I wore long sleeve.
I know. Yeah. We couldn't get it oscillating because it made noise. It was straight. Yeah. But it's not bad, you can feel it.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
That's always key.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, I think we will get started. I see everyone has been able to partake in some of the goodies here, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. I would like to start off with traditional land acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation, or Red River Métis Nation, pardon me. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and I have a few additional thank yous to address as well. I'd like to thank the Homecoming Committee who have been part of this lecture series, putting it all together. Maybe if you could just give a quick wave when you mention your name, or stand up a bit. Vicki Verge, she's the co-chair with myself, Bridget Kazera. Sid Frankel, in the back. Joel Montgomery, and Bria Henderson, also our photographer for the day. Thanks very much. I'd like to speak a little bit about the Baird Poskanzer Memorial Lecture Series, just to give you a bit of a background information. We do have some pamphlets on the back table to give you some additional information, but I'm just going to speak about it briefly. The Faculty of Social Work is fortunate to have dedicated funds provided annually in order to be able to host the Baird Poskanzer Memorial Lecture Series. The lecture series was instituted to perpetuate the memory of Professor Poskanzer and to provide the opportunity for distinguished academics to come to Winnipeg to share their thoughts and ideas. Baird Poskanzer was one of the group of social workers who were instrumental in the enactment of an act to incorporate the Manitoba Institute of Registered Social Workers, which was assented April 27th, 1966. He was also instrumental in the establishment of the generalist BSW program at University of Manitoba. Please stay tuned for next year's event, which is often held in late September to coincide with homecoming. As Dr. Chapman has also indicated, he would prefer to donate his stipend to an Indigenous-run harm reduction, street outreach, or two-spirit-focused organization. A donation will be made to Velma's House, which is an Indigenous-led 24/7 low-barrier safe space here in Winnipeg. Many thanks to Dr. Chapman for making this possible. And now a little bit about Dr. Chris Chapman. As part of the lecture series, the Faculty of Social Work welcomes Dr. Chapman, Associate Professor, York University, to speak on the history of the social work profession in their book, A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression in the Moral Economies of Social Working. A Violent History of Benevolence traces how normative histories of liberalism, progress, and social work enact and obscure systemic violences. The book aims to invite contemporary social workers and others to reflect on the complex nature of contemporary social work, and specifically on the present-day structural violences that social work enacts in the name of benevolence. Dr. Chapman will talk about their book and explore how normative social work history is structured in a way that contemporary social workers can know many details about social work's violences without ever imagining that they may also be complicit in these violences. Dr. Chapman will also discuss concepts from their book and how the framings of social work's history actively create present-day political and ethical irresponsibility, even among those who imagine themselves to be anti-oppressive, liberal, or radical. Dr. Chapman's research explores ways that everyday interpersonal encounters and ethical navigations relate to interlocking forms of oppression in both the past and present, including within social work and the helping profession. And I'd just like to point out, we have a few of his books here that are available for purchase for $50, and he's also volunteered to make those copies signed as well if you're interested. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Chapman, and there'll be some time for questions afterwards. So welcome, Dr. Chapman.
This is the first time I've done this in like 3 years, and I'm really nervous. But anyway, I'm just going to go into it. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and thank you for the Homecoming Committee for organizing everything. I know it's a lot of work to pull off these events, and it's truly an honor to be here. I want to start by asking how many people in the room have a social work degree or a social work diploma or are currently working on one? Is it most of the people who are in the room? Most of the people, okay. And now I want to get you to think, not today, but think back to your first day of social work school. I shouldn't probably walk away from the microphone. And think about whether you yourself or anybody that was in your sort of like intimate circle, whether family, friends, community members, had ever had, whether you knew of instances where social workers had been involved in people's lives in ways that felt like an unwelcome intrusion, or where harm was done, or where things got worse as a result. If you're comfortable doing that, can I see a show of hands, whether? Okay, so about the same as when I asked that question in Toronto. It's usually about half the people. And my sense is that there's, I mean, not that this maps on perfectly, but that there's a, start my timer. My sense is that there's a divide that where in some communities, in what I'm going to call ruling class communities, if you grow up and you tell people that you're going to go to social work school, people are likely to say something like, wow, it takes a special kind of person to do that work. But if you grow up in a community where people are more likely to have non-voluntary social workers in your life, your childhood friends might say something like, why on earth would you do that? So there's a really different understanding of what social work is from community to community. Now, again, think about when you first went to social work school. Is there anyone in this room who decided to go into social work because they wanted to harm people? You can show your hand if you want. Or to control people, to oppress people. It's curious, right? Is there anyone who went into social work because they wanted to help people? Or to make the world a better place, to try to work for change? Right? So, I think the situation is that a lot of people experience their social workers as harmful and oppressive, but nobody goes into social work because they want to harm and oppress people. I think that's actually true. So basically what we try to do in the book is kind of trace out, like, how did we get here? And specifically, how did we get, how did we get to 1900 when social work really first emerged? What's the prehistory that made social work kind of show up the way it did, right? Like I'm not going to go off script because I will not be on time if I do that. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. What I do want to do first is I have a bit of a trigger warning and I want to check in with people about something. Interlocking oppression is in the title. I'm going to be talking about a number of kinds of violence. I'm not going to be talking specific details, but I'll be making reference to anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, violence against disabled people, anti-Muslim violence, mostly those, I guess. But I also have a whole bunch of slides, and 2 of these slides, including the next one that I'm going to show, or I'm going to check in with you about whether I'm going to show it, include before and after images of children who were stolen from their families and confined to an Indian residence. And for about a year now, I've been kind of grappling with, I'm a white person and what it means for me to show these images, and whether the value they have in sort of looking at how violent society is worth the danger to people who might experience harm from me showing those images. So I just want to invite anyone, if there's even one person who doesn't want me to show those images, I'll skip them and I'll describe them instead. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and show them then. Where am I? So these are images of Annie Wolfe on the top and Thomas More Cusick on the bottom. Annie Wolfe was a white girl who was taken from her family somewhere in the States, I don't actually remember, and placed in a children's aid society. And her photo was taken in 1892, just the year before. The photo, which you've probably seen before, of Thomas More Cusick, who was a Muskopeto Soto child was taken from his family in what's now called Saskatchewan and confined to an Indian residential school. I think it's really important when sharing Thomas's image to say that, like almost half of children who were incarcerated in these schools, he died as a result of being there, and so I want to name that. It's really important. It's incredibly tragic. And I also want us to think about how the images themselves are already violent. And they're violent even if nobody had died. They're violent if there wasn't anything like hitting that everyone knows is violence that had happened. So again, these were taken a year apart from one another. The photographer of Annie's picture was super famous. It's very unlikely it was the same photographer. And so I just want to draw our attention to the after photos and how similar they are, which I find viscerally unsettling, I guess. There's the pose and the flower pot, and that there's something happening in the sort of collective unconsciousness of the day, or the collective consciousness of the that make this out to be a success story, right? That make this out to be a sort of form of optimism, which I'll talk about later, a violent optimism about the possibility of transformation. In a book about the history of social work, Leslie Margolin talks about Annie's photo and says that it portrays for its reader the promise of the healing power of class. So this was actually a photo that it was like for a coffee table book that ruling class people would like have in their living room and flip through and look at poor people's children, called Children of the Poor, which was intended as a consciousness-raising thing, right? Like he was a progressive. Basically, everyone I'm going to be talking about today considered themselves to be progressive, trying to do things for the betterment of the world. So the healing power of class is the promise that Leslie Margolin says Annie's photo shows. And images like that of Thomas and other children who were taken from their families at the time, Indigenous children who were taken from their families at the time, I think also suggests that there was an imagined healing power of, we can say, whiteness, assimilation, colonization, white supremacy that was imagined at the time as well. And so again, what I want us to think about is how did we get there, right? Not just where we've gone from there, but and what's the history of the emergence of a profession that rests upon, I'm going to say this slowly because it's a sort of key piece to our book. We suggest that the profession rests on an ethic of relating in which a healing power is sort of attributed to the helper based on a sort of fictional moral superiority. And sometimes that's across class lines, sometimes it's across race lines, obviously sometimes these interlock. Sometimes it is about disability and non-disability, sometimes it's about cis-heteropatriarchy, and so on. But over and over and over again, there's this idea of moral superiority that enables us as social workers to kind of do, I'm just going to say, like, whatever the fuck we want to people and believe that we're helping them. That was not in my notes, but anyway, that's what came out of my mouth. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back, and I want to play a clip from Thomas King. It's from his book, The Truth About Stories, and a slight variation of what he says in this clip is how he introduces every single chapter. So it's obviously really important to him that we kind of take this in. I'm sorry it's so blurry.
There's a story I know. It's about the Earth and how it floats in space on the back of a turtle. I've heard this story many times, and each time someone tells the story, it changes. Sometimes the change is simply in the voice of the storyteller. Sometimes the change is in the details. Sometimes in the order of events. Other times it's the dialogue or the response of the audience. But in all the telling of all the tellers, the world never leaves the turtle's back, and the turtle never swims away. One time it was in Moncton, I think, a woman with a baby in the audience asked about the turtle and the Earth. If the Earth was on the back of a turtle, what was below the turtle? Another turtle, the storyteller told her. And below that turtle, another turtle. And below that, another turtle. The woman began to chuckle and rock her baby, enjoying the game, I imagine. So, how many turtles are there, she wanted to know. The storyteller shrugged. No one knows for sure, he told her, but it's turtles all the way down. The truth about stories is that that's all we are.
So I think that when he says the truth about stories is that's all we are, right after saying it's turtles all the way down, what he's inviting us to think about is that it's stories all the way down. Our realities are all the way down. Stories upon stories upon stories, stories about previous stories that are about previous stories, and so on. Client case files is a really good example of that, especially someone who's been through many, many systems in their life. You can sometimes get these huge files about story after story after story, starting sometimes when they're very young, even if you're meeting them as an adult. And it's certainly true of histories. And so today I want us to think about the stories that get told about social work and other kinds of professional helping, as well as the stories that don't usually get told. In terms of the stories that are told, I want us to think about how they're told, and I also want us to think about how they shape what we know, what we think, even what we feel and intuit about ourselves, about social service users, about the world we live in, and so on. Does that sound okay? I'm glad, because I don't really have a backup plan, although, whatever. I would ad-lib it, I suppose, if that's what happened. So, of course, I'm going to start here. Not of course. This is Doctor Who's time and space machine. It's called the TARDIS. I am going to be flopping around from place to place and era to era, but I actually want to highlight what's on the front of it, just as a quick introduction to say, does everyone know what St. John's Ambulance is? Yeah, so that's a quick way for me to say, we suggest in the book that the initial shift, way before professional social work emerged, in the direction of the healing power of class, whiteness, non-disability, and so on, goes way back to the Crusades, 1,000 years earlier, and a shift that happened in Christian ethics at that time. The Order of St. John, the Order of the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, I'm just going to be referring to them as the Hospitallers, much later created St. John's Ambulance. They're still around today. They still do work. Yes, it's the same group. But I'm going to be referring to them as the Hospitallers because it serves my purposes best. And that's how I first became obsessed with them, was hearing about the Knights Hospitallers, but I'll get there in a second. So previous to the Crusades, this is something I certainly didn't know, previous to the First Crusade, Christians were not allowed to use violence or coercion to try to get people to convert to Christianity. It wasn't allowed. No one had ever done that before. And yeah, you couldn't use war or violence against non-Christians to get to heaven, to be absolved of your sins, or any of that. It simply didn't exist. So there was this group in Jerusalem who operated what was a shelter, really, for Christian, Muslim, and Jewish people who lived there or who were passing through. And their ethic was that they would treat people who were at their shelter as luxuriously as they would treat Jesus. That was how they talked about what they were doing. And there was no efforts whatsoever to change people, including trying to convert them to Christianity. But then Pope Urban II called on all Christians to invade Jerusalem. And this same group was as big a deal as the the famous knights that everyone's heard of, though I can't think of now. Anyway, they were one of the foremost military forces at the time. And so they went from feeding and nursing Muslim people to killing them. And both things were considered a way to get to heaven, be absolved of your sins, and all that stuff. And this was an absolutely new thing that happened in Christianity. Now, this is where it gets a little more relevant, maybe, to our time and to thinking about social work. About 600 years later, what's often called the first Indian Reserve in what's now called Canada was created. It was named after its funder and its co-founder, whose name was Sillery. And Sillery was a member of the Hospitallers, as were a number of people who were active in New France at the time. And so I want to pause to consider the change in Christian ethics from the original hospital in Jerusalem to what was happening at Sillery. In the original hospital, people were given as luxurious treatment as they could possibly be given with no effort to try to change people whatsoever. And at Sillery, 600 years later, there was food given, there was shelter given, there was comfort given, but only if you adopted Christianity. That's a really big difference. It was now only ethical to help someone if you also tried to make them a different kind of person. This is a new ethic, and it's very much alive and well today. So these are a couple quotes about more contemporary stuff. Thomas King, again, same book, talks about a Western Judeo-Christian sense of responsibility containing the unexamined implication that the lives of Native people needed improvement, and talking about social work and Indigenous people. Cindy Blackstock writes that the notion of improving other people is endemic to social work. And this ethic, or what King calls a sense of responsibility, is now standard in the helping professions. I'm going to play a clip now from someone talking about disabled people, and I want you to just notice the "of course" that she says, because it's so obvious that this is how it would be.
I saw the people in power, the medical and the allied health professionals, all too often talking about people with disabilities as manipulative, as needing instruction and needing direction and needing to be pushed. That was a big word. They needed to be pushed to do what was right for them. And of course, what was right for them was being decided by people who were outside the immediate disability experience.
Right, of course it was people who didn't have the actual experience who were saying what it was, right? So I'm kind of suggesting that that's what happens all the time, all over the place in social work. And I also want to say, I'm going to play a little clip from Angela Davis where she's encouraging us, like she does all over the place all the time, to refuse to accept what is simply because it is. It doesn't have to be this way. It hasn't always been this way, and it won't always be this way. She's talking about something that her mother said to her when she was 3 or 4.
My mother explained racism and segregation to me. And what she said, and I'll never forget this, was that she said, "This is not the way things are supposed to be. This might be the way they are now, but they are not supposed to be this way." And she said, "They will not always be this way."
Whoops. Okay, sorry. We'll get to Charles Grant soon, I promise, but not quite yet. So the photos of Annie and Thomas were from the 1890s. And I talked about some of the changes that happened long ago, and that was slowly happening in different areas that we sort of look at. But what we suggest in the book is that these photos reflected the need to change people and this idea that morally superior people can do that, which first really became institutionalized or sort of standardized slowly 1 century earlier in the 1790s. So I'm going to spend some time there. I know it seems like a long ways ago, but it's important to know that it hasn't always been this way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about colonial education, imprisonment, and what would soon be called psychiatry. The word didn't exist yet at the time. So about 100 years before professional social work emerged, what we call in the book the ethic of the healing power of imagined moral superiority emerged in a number of distinct sites of liberal and progressive reform. And this last point is really, really important. These were changes brought about by people who fancied themselves progressive, liberal, working to make the world a better place. They believed they were working for a much more just society according to the stories that circulated amongst white ruling classes at the time. And I want to highlight that as a cautionary tale for us all today when we think that we're working for progressive social change. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't be working for progressive social change, just that we need to be careful about our, well, what I would consider my tendencies towards self-righteousness. So before the 1790s, ruling class white discourse held that colonized, enslaved, and racialized people weren't exactly human. We might say that moving away from this particular dehumanizing belief was a good thing, but the exact shift that happened enabled new violences that were previously unknown. Talal Asad writes that the Enlightenment, which was this period of time, brought with it, this is a quote, a readiness to cause pain to those who are being saved by being humanized, using violence to connect an optimistic account of universal empowerment with a pessimistic account of human motivation. So what does that mean? It means that anybody could be changed for the, better, according to white ruling class ideas, but people wouldn't do it on their own. And so it was ethical, it was right to sort of do whatever you needed to do to make people into what was considered better people. And that's what we're going to be looking at in these 3 examples from the 1790s. So I'm going to touch on 3 different things. As I said, this is Charles Grant. So Charles Grant wrote the first ever European argument for the mass education of colonized people in 1792. It was in reference to South Asian people, and you can feel free to gag along with me as I read the title. Observations on the state of society among the Asiatic subjects of Great Britain, particularly with respect to morals, and on the means of improving it. Right? So we have this moral inferiority, particularly moral inferiority, and that, of course, it needs to be improved. So basically, he said South Asian people aren't yet capable of rational and moral self-governance, but they could become capable of these things if given a British education. I imagine some of you are students, some of you have been students. Have people encountered Homi Bhabha's words? They're quoted quite a bit as the aim of colonialism being to create new kinds of people who are, this is the quote, almost the same but not quite, almost the same but not white. He's actually talking about Charles Grant when he writes that. So yeah, that's something. In the same decade as Grant first rationalized mass assimilative colonial education, whoops, I didn't want to show that yet. Anyway, whatever. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. The practice of imprisoning people for long periods of time with the intention of making them better people first emerged. No one had ever done that before. It was an invention that you could take people who were confined and change who they were and make them better. I'll talk about this in a second, but that's not what I want to talk about first. However ridiculous and harmful and violent a story that is, it's still very alive and well with us today, right? So this progressive shift was led by a group called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, right? Note the good intentions. It included Benjamin Franklin and the guy known as the father of American psychiatry named Benjamin Rush. And this was the birth of the penitentiary. It happened in Pennsylvania at a place called the Walnut Street Jail. So the penitentiary was a place of penitence. It wasn't just removal. It wasn't just incarceration. It was a place where you would go and repent for your sins and change who you were. I mentioned Talal Asad before in this sort of Enlightenment optimism and pessimism, and Angela Davis illustrates that with respect to 2 key prison reformers of the day, John Howard and Jeremy Bentham. John Howard conceptualized imprisonment as an occasion for religious self-reflection and self-reform, and Jeremy Bentham agreed, but he also claimed that criminals could only internalize productive labor habits if they were under constant surveillance. And so in this exact same decade as Charles Grant and the first penitentiary, Jeremy Bentham planned this architectural model called the panopticon. It was intended for not only prisoners, but also patients, workers, students, anyone who you needed to make different kinds of people, make them be productive. And the idea is that they would only be productive, they would only change who they are if they're under constant surveillance. I love this gorgeous, crisp image from the Bentham papers in London, but it doesn't really illustrate it as well as these, so I'm going to talk about these drawings instead. On the left, you have the watchtower in the center. It's from the top down, and then you can see all the cells are organized around it. And then on the right, this is from the inside of one of the cells, so you can see there's a watchtower, and then there's dozens, maybe hundreds of cells where other people are praying, pretending to pray, praying to get released from this terrible place. I'm not really sure, because they might be observed at any moment. And they might be punished if they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They might be rewarded if they're doing what they're supposed to do. This is another image of violence. It's not always violence when people pray. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But when people are compelled to do art therapy, prayer, yoga, talk therapy, when people are compelled to do it, it's violence, right? And I think we don't think enough about consent when we think about social work and its relationship to structural violence. Yeah, so again, the idea is that people who are deemed less than human will only become more fully human if they believe they're being observed and judged and so on. Not a move toward nonviolence, but it was a significant shift in the tactics and the rationales of violence. Foucault talks about this period, and he says that penal torture targeted the body, but that the new penitentiary or prison targeted the very soul of the prisoner. And that's not nonviolence. The last development of the 1790s I want to touch upon is considered the birth of psychiatry. This is a related painting anyway. It's in a different site, but the same doctor who gets credit. Just as the new prisons were narrated as gentle in the ways that people talked about them at the time, it's most often referred to as the liberation of the mad. I'm going to suggest that's a really unjust way of describing what actually happened. So as the story goes, Dr. Philippe Pinel removed the chains that shackled mad people to walls at Bicêtre Hospital near Paris. But he actually learned at least some of what he was doing and this sort of optimism that I'm talking about from a woman who worked in the hospital and her ex-patient husband who also worked there. But of course, in history, the male medical doctor gets all the credit. That's not a shocker, but that's how it goes. And whether this is true of what they did previous to him even starting there or not, what Pinel did was not nonviolent. If you read it, it's very clear he's using emotional violence and physical violence, but with a curative intent. And so because of his good intention, it was framed as nonviolent. It was framed as gentle. Interestingly, or tellingly, I guess, the straitjacket was invented at Bicêtre Hospital, the same hospital, 2 years before the unchaining happened, 1790, I think. And Pinel made sure he had a straitjacket available for every single person that he unchained, right? So we're not talking about nonviolence. But the most important thing to know about this so-called liberation is that the mass confinement of mad people was not common at all outside of France and French colonies. So on the lands now called Canada, only in New France were mad people really confined. Where they were confined is a little complicated because the difference between a poorhouse, a hospital, and a jail didn't really exist the way it does today. But anyway, other places, really rare did that happen. But about the 1850s, so about 60 years later, countries all over Europe and white settler colonies started building massive asylums because it was now narrated as curative. And so nation state now called Canada. The first one was in Toronto, and it's still there. It's been reformed many, many times. It's now called CAMH. Yeah, so what's also important for us to just notice is that there are very few places in the world today where there aren't mad people who are confined and criminalized people who are confined for long periods of time, and that's simply because of colonization and imperialism. It wasn't independently invented in 18,000 different places. We're talking Pennsylvania, we're talking near Paris, and then now everywhere. Okay, so these developments may not seem all that interconnected, but I think this helps to connect them and also get a sense of like how deeply people at the time believed that this was all wonderful stuff that was happening. In 1854, the head of a medical clinic in France wrote that colonial missionaries are Pinels. That's the doctor, Pinel. He said that he praised the missionaries of civilization who, this is a quote, and it's super problematic, who seek to cure the prejudices, false traditions, and errors of colonized peoples, and he contrasted this with earlier conquering armies who claim to bring civilization through the brutal force of arms, who act on nations in the way that chains and prisons act on the unfortunate and sane. What I think is really even more disturbing and getting us more into social work is that the head of this French clinic said that in-depth colonization is carried out by the organization of the European family. It's by introducing the family, the European nuclear family, into the traditions and errors, this is all a quote, of colonized people that one truly begins the work of colonization, right? So the true work of transforming the soul. And this is the other before and after image I wanted to share, because I think that this before and after image of this young Cheyenne woman named Waxy Hori is, again, violently illustrating this sense of optimism at the time, right? And about this idea of introducing the family and European ways of relating with one another into the family. So it's not nonviolence. Diane Millian, in a brilliant book called Therapeutic Nations, is discussing white settler colonialism in what's now called Canada. And she says that colonialism in Indigenous terms is the dismembering of families and societies. And she writes that the Indian Act altered gender relations in the communities because it's the law that constructed a hierarchical patriarchy and legislates and morally polices a heterosexual norm, barring non-monogamous, non-heterosexual union. And I would also say a nuclear family norm. So, yeah. And this is what I'm talking about the violent optimism of the time. Okay, so I'm going to transition a little bit, and I'm going to not talk, I don't think, at all about the 1790s, but I am going to be talking mostly about the 1890s, which is the time of this photograph. 1890s, and so on. So I'm going to be a social worker. I'm going to end poverty by myself. It's a joke, right? We could unpack that and all sorts of things. But what I actually want to draw your attention to is on the side here. Jane Addams and Mary Richmond are so proud of you. We love to talk about them. It's a little weird. Leslie Margolin, in a book I mentioned earlier, says that we as social workers tend to talk Jane Addams but do Mary Richmond. It's a really important critique. But what's fascinating is that he can write those words and know that if we have a social work degree, we're going to know that he's saying we talk social justice and do surveillance and intrusion, right? That's interesting. And so I'm curious about the stories upon stories that center these two white American women. So yeah, check this out. This was a conference in Portugal. Why are they centering Jane Addams and Mary Richmond in a conference in Portugal? What are all the things that get left out of this story in Portugal and elsewhere, right? But also, it makes both of them, Addams and Richmond, into a bit of a like cartoon or caricature that doesn't really fit. I was on my way here this morning, and I was regretting that I don't have this quote from Friendly Visiting in the Poor in my slides, where Mary Richmond very clearly is a liberal and not the conservative that I had always learned that she was. But anyway, trust me on that, and if you want to email me, I'll send you the page number. The book's available online. But anyway, they're both kind of made into a caricature. So maybe you did, but I'll ask anyway. Did you know that Jane Addams was a strong supporter of eugenics? Yeah? I mean, so were Emma Goldman and Helen Keller, but still, like, our Jane Addams? Like, that can't be true, right? She's our social justice wing. Now, you might have known that Addams never married a man, and she spent her life with another woman who she shared a bed with, even when they traveled. They exchanged love letters. And maybe we know that because it like fits our stories to claim her as queer. It's a little complicated, and we could talk about that after, because she was really moralistic about sex. Maybe, anyway, whatever. Whatever was happening between the sheets, we don't know. But my question is, did you know that that was also true of Richmond? That doesn't fit with our stories, right? We wouldn't want to reclaim Mary Richmond as queer. But if Jane Addams was queer, and I mean, if we can include both being a lesbian and being asexual in that umbrella, then for sure, lots and lots and lots of women at the time were queer. And we'll never know, really, what they were doing and what they weren't. At any rate, when we allow any single figures to stand in for entire movements, it inevitably leaves people out. Also, it was a way of resisting like compulsory heterosexuality. And there's lots of things I could say about that. Anyway, whatever. Ask me about it later, and I'll go on and on about monasteries and all sorts of things that I think have been places of refuge for people all over the place for forever. Anyway, when we allow any single figures to stand in for entire movements, it inevitably leaves people out. And it leaves people out who are really famous and important even at the time. And again, Angela Davis says this really well, so I'll let her say it. Oops, if I can make my PowerPoint work.
Often those who contribute most powerfully to movements for radical social change are erased in the histories that are transmitted from generation to generation. And
Whoops. Well, okay. Well, one person who's left out of social work histories, when I press stop, it goes on to the next slide, is Ida B. Wells. Wells Barnett, after she got married, so you can see her referred to in both ways. You'll find lots about her in histories of black feminism, in histories of black radical activism. You'll find very little about her in histories of social work. But she was involved in all sorts of things that, like women's clubs that are what people were doing when social work was galvanizing at the time. And all of the things that she did with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and, yes, Jane Addams, this is the same kind of work that Jane Addams gets the credit for being the radical that she is, alongside Ida B. Wells, really importantly. She first became famous when she successfully sued a railroad for racial segregation 60 years before Rosa Parks was arrested. She was famous. She was the most important anti-lynching activist of the day. This was her first anti-lynching publication. It came out in 1892. That's the same year as I think Annie Wolf's photo was, just to get a sense of what all was happening at the time. So what was mainstream professional social work up to when Wells, who was an already famous anti-racism activist, published her first widely read and influential anti-lynching piece? Well, it's entirely non-controversial to say that professional social work in the United States, but also in Canada, really emerged out of this group called the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about what happened that year at their conference. So, of course, they would have invited Wells to come and speak, right? Yeah, they didn't. They did invite someone who's also famous. You may not recognize his name when I first say it, but you've heard his words. You probably can't see this, but among other things, they invited Captain Richard Henry Pratt to speak. Does anyone recognize that name? I promise you've heard the words that I'm going to build up to. He created the prototype Indian Industrial School, as they were called mostly in the States. This is a pamphlet advertising it. You can see the kind of the blueprint for the before and after pictures. So he came up with the model of Indian residential schooling. Yep, and he was invited by the National Conference of Charities and Corrections to speak. I want to really highlight that they invited him. And it was in front of this audience, in front of people who 8 years later would be called social workers. The term didn't exist yet. Someone told me recently that it might have existed in German before, but anyway, I don't remember. I haven't looked that up. But anyway, it didn't exist in English. It was in front of this audience that he first articulated the aim of the schools as to kill the Indian and save the man. Those words were first spoken at the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. Do you think I know that from a social work historian? I do not. I know it from Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Indian. That's actually where I know the story of Sillery as well, although I was already really obsessed with the Order of the Hospitallers at the time. But it's interesting how many of these histories are out there, but they're not being talked about in social work. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about Pratt. As you can imagine, it's an incredibly racist piece. It starts somewhat surprisingly with a story about a black man who is a servant and also, I don't even know how to say this, it's just very racist, and also a gentleman. And that's the whole point of the story. And because this black man can be a gentleman, the title of the paper is The Advantages of Mingling Indians with Whites. Because this black man can be a gentleman, Indigenous kids can also be ladies and gentlemen if they mingle with white people. That's his whole argument. Absolutely racist. And the audience that he's speaking back to is conservatives of the day. It's very, very clear that he's trying to convince people that change is possible because he fancied himself a liberal. It feels awful to say that, but it's true, and it's really important. Conservatives of the day didn't believe that any change was possible, right? The part highlighted on the right-hand side, oh yeah, and I just want to say again, they invited him to speak because they saw what he was doing as so relevant to what they were doing. The part highlighted on the right-hand side is a whole tribute. There were 4 different speakers who gave tribute to the late Oscar McCullough. That's this guy here. He was a recently deceased charity organization society leader, so the same as Mary Richmond. But he also published one of the earliest and most influential eugenist books called The Tribe of Ishmael, A Study in Social Degradation. So he was being honored. Lots of social workers would have died that year, but he was the one being honored for his contributions, and this was his most significant contribution. Now, I'm not advocating replacing any story with any other single story, but I do think this tells a different story than this. And they're both partial, none of them is complete. There's lots of other stories I'm not going to touch on today. There's lots of stories I don't know. But I think we need to sort of challenge ourselves to try to tell more and more and more complex stories to really get a sense of what all was happening. Okay, so yeah, I'm over time. That's okay. I'm gonna keep going. I am supposed to have talked for about a half an hour at this point, and so I thought maybe, even though I'm talking about really serious stuff, I might introduce just a little bit of playfulness to kind of make sure everyone's still awake and all that stuff. And so here are Pratt and McCullough. And when I first put these slides together, I was like, wait a minute, they have the same nose. And I've seen that nose somewhere before. Did you know this? Eugenicists believed that you could tell if someone was a criminal or not based on the shape of their nose and ears. So I've highlighted one of the noses there. It gives some pause. These are both people who committed crimes against humanity. Maybe it was because of the shape of their noses. But of course not, right? And even if it was true, these ruling class white men would never have been subjected to eugenics confinement. That's another important story that we don't tell very often. The main tactic of eugenics at the time was confining people in racially segregated sites so they wouldn't procreate. Why don't we tell that story anymore? Because we still confine all the same people in sometimes racially segregated, but in gender segregated sites. Ones that target disabled people don't always have locked doors today. Sometimes they're much smaller. We might call them a group home. But we still have these congregate settings where we house people, where the same people as were being housed in these congregate settings 100 years ago. Anyway, there are things that could have potentially made these men into a eugenics concern, right? So for some eugenicists, those who weren't anarchists or communists, because there were lots of them, but if they were an anarchist or a communist, they would have been considered unfit, right? Aha. But if they were interested in other men, if they were sexually or romantically involved with other men or wear lipstick, for sure they would have been considered unfit. Except if we think about interlocking oppression, it would have been a no, like a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation, right? They would have been left to do whatever they're doing and continued to reap violence and oppression in the world. Anyway, that was a very fun slide to get put together, so thank you for letting me do that. I'm going to go back to McCullough. Some of you might have noticed that I have a little quote from his book here on the side. First, I want to notice that this is the 4th edition, printed in 1891. The first edition was 1888. I said that this was really widely read. It was reprinted 4 times in the first 3 years after its publication. And again, it was originally from the 15th National Conference of Charities and Corrections. But what else was professional social work up to at this time? Pretty significant thing. In 1888, in this eugenics thing, he's saying what his recommendations are. His 3rd recommendation, we must get hold of the children of unfit parents. So what was professional social work up to at the time? This is from the timeline that we have at the back of the book. So a very widely read eugenics book was written by a member of the Charity Organization Society. 3 years later, Canada's first CAS was founded. 3 years later, when it was reprinted for the 4th time. In the same year, 14 Hopi people were imprisoned at Alcatraz for trying to prevent their children from being confined to an Indian industrial school. And in the same year, US Indian Commissioner Thomas J. Morgan compared the schools to asylums and prisons, because it was on purpose, which actually Roland Christjohn and Sherry Young talk about in a book called The Circle Game, which is incredible. And Roland Christjohn's other book, Dying to Please You, also, I think everybody in social work school should read that book. Anyway, where am I? I'm not even on the right page. So all this stuff was happening right after McCullough made these recommendations. This is J.J. Kelso. He founded the first CAS in Toronto in Canada. The land's now called Canada. These are the Hopi folks who were imprisoned at Alcatraz. And what I want to ask is, who in these stories was doing what we might really consider child protection? What I'm wanting you to consider is that it was these guys, right? I wrote this book with A.J. Withers. One day I called them out of the blue. I was pretty manic, actually, and really excited about this. A.J. said, in all the reading you've done, have you seen any mention of a Black-run Children's Aid Society? No, they said. I was like, we need to look into this. So another story that's not often told is that going back to the time of the Underground Railroad, when, as you can imagine, what later were called settlement services were needed for people who were escaped slaves, Black people ran all the things that social work would later be credited for doing, including settlement houses. But I can talk about that later if you want. There were Black food banks, there were Black orphanages, there were Black care homes, and so on. But there doesn't seem to have been a single Black-run organization in which a stranger went into someone else's house and determined whether the parents were fit to be parents. It didn't exist. At this point in time, until the end of legal racial segregation, Black people were rarely apprehended because of racial segregation. There were odd exceptions, but they were quite exceptional. So for example, Malcolm X's mother was institutionalized, single mother at that point, and when she was institutionalized, he and his siblings were taken into state care, but the helping professions in the state were already involved in the family, right? So it didn't happen very often. This is a quote from the book. I don't know why I put so much text there, but I'm just going to sum up some things that I want us to notice in it. Zanana Akande describes people she calls social workers who weren't social workers, community members who took collective care for the children in Toronto when she grew up in the 1940s and 50s. In Black communities prior to the imposition of social work professionals' version of child protection, practices existed, established practices existed by which people protected children and dealt with things like parental death and figured out who the children would be cared for. So again, one of the things I really want us to consider, and I promise I'm almost done, all of us, meaning well beyond the people who are in this room, is what does child protection really mean? what legacies are following in the work we're doing. And if we really started from beginning and said, how would we want to protect our children? And really thought about it in terms of like everyone's children and not just people who continue to be considered morally inferior, what kind of a system would we come up with? What kind of strategies would we come up with? And I don't think it would look very, very much like what we have right now. Okay. I would say the same thing about what we want to do with people who are in emotional distress, what we want to do with people who are seeing things that I don't see, what we want to do with people who are causing harm in our communities. I think we'd come up with really different things if we started from scratch. Okay, I'm really going to stop there. I've already shared lots of stories with you. Maybe some have been new to you, maybe not, but I want to end going back to Thomas King. And this is how he ends every chapter in the same book, with an invitation for, and sort of a way of connecting stories to ethics, which I have written there, but I'll let him say it anyway.
But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. Thank you.
And that's it.
Thank you very much, Chris, or Dr. Chapman.
Chris's.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Chris? Dr. Chris? How about Dr. Chris? I'm going to,
What was the book that you were referencing by Thomas King? Oh, The Truth About Stories is what these are from, but also the stories that I shared about histories is from a book called... Can you go to the I'm sorry. Online here? Of course. I'm so sorry. What was the book by Thomas King? So there's two books. The two video clips were both from The Truth About Stories, and the other book that talked about both Sillery and Captain Richard Henry Pratt, and where he first gave that speech was The Inconvenient Indian.
Alex, I'm going to bring you the mic, so please wait so that people online can hear you.
It's kind of on the themes of books again, but you mentioned a book that absolutely every social worker should read, but I didn't catch the name.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to pitch this book. It's called Dying to Please You, and it's about the discourses surrounding Indigenous suicide. Among other things, I think of myself as like a disability studies, mad studies scholar, and I think it's the most important thing that's been written in that field maybe ever. It's really fascinating. So it's two Indigenous authors. They are not naming themselves as doing mad studies, but they're really unpacking all the ways that basically that genocide gets individualized and turned into things like depression and alcoholism, and it's beautiful, and they're witty too. They talk about any sort of diagnosis you can imagine and call them gremlins that live in our brain, and they have these like scientific looking drawings of like a brain that has like gremlin, and anyway, it's a beautiful book. And then also The Circle Game is a book that he wrote with Sherry Young in 1986 about shadows and substance in, like, I don't remember exactly the title, but it's about how, same idea about how Indian residential schools are individualized as well, and they're really critical. There was an idea at the time of residential school syndrome, and they were really upset about that and wanting people to say this isn't a syndrome, this is genocide. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, Dr. Frankel.
Chris, how much do you think that more critical approaches to social work have changed things or not changed things?
It's a really good question. I'm like, I'd say I would answer that question almost differently any moment of any day. I do believe, I'm a social work educator. I do believe that we're doing important work when we're trying to think about doing this work really differently. One of my concerns, I guess, having gone through a few social work degrees at schools that consider themselves anti-oppressive and critical and all that stuff, is how much we tend to distance ourselves from, so that for me, that's why it's really important. It's really important to me that Mary Richmond was not the conservative that I learned that she was. And again, I wish, basically what she says in that section, she says, you know, there's the over-enthusiastic social justice advocates that say that no one's responsible for anything, and then there's the people who blame individuals for everything that happens. And what we need is to find a safe middle ground, right? It's like a classic liberal thing to say. If there's any more classic liberal thing to say, it's to say that people are blank slates. That's a quote that's used in The Advantages of Mingling Indians with Whites. I promise he's speaking against conservatives. It's shocking, but it's true. And people, and yeah, I think for me, we need to really try to sort of develop our muscles. I don't mean our muscles, but our like, our muscles around being open when people say things to us, which, you know, if there's people who've practiced social work here in the room, probably some of you have had people say, like, I have, you know, you're ruining my life. Like, what are you doing? This is, how could you possibly do this? I think we need to get really better at listening to that and being like, okay. And then the structures that are all around us that might prevent us from really doing much differently, right? And right now, this isn't exactly responding to your question, but it is in a roundabout way. One of the things I'm really worried about is that where I think there can be lots of promise for work being done differently is when people do things kind of in spite of the institutions that they work in and so on. So there's one of the things we talk about in the book is a man named Mohammed Slahi, I think that's his name, and he was a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. And he wrote a memoir, and he talks about these guards who were almost like friends to him. It's interesting that he doesn't consider them friends, and they use that word, and he's like, that's not exactly the right thing because the power differential is too much. But he does say that they made his time there less miserable than it would have been. And we can imagine how terrible a place that was, and that even there, the prison guards being different, the military guards being different, made a difference for him. And so one of the things I'm really concerned about is when we get less and less wiggle room to do things differently, right? So in Ontario right now, there's a group of agencies called EPION, which is the Early Intervention for Psychosis Network. And the kind of mainstream of that network has often done things that I don't think are good. But people were left to sort of do their work in whatever way they did. And so some people were doing it in ways that were really decolonizing and really kind of informed by MAD movements and so on, informed by the Healing Voices Network and open dialogue and stuff like that. And now they're having a model imposed on them that's the sort of most medical model version, and people are being made to do it, meet with people every week, I think, to kind of get supervision from the person in the States who is charged with making sure they're adhering to this model. And so people who've been doing really good work against the system, within the system, for years are actually leaving because they can't do it anymore. But I think it also makes a difference. So let me also say that it makes a difference when there's room for it to make a difference, right? Yeah, another example I could say, I'm sorry my examples are all from Ontario, it's where I hear all these stories from students and others, but a few years ago, so in Ontario and probably here, the child welfare system for years has been doing these little things here, anti-oppression roundtable, and starting to take seriously in talk, anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. But what they also did was introduce this whole new computing system that takes so much time to do every little thing that people actually have less time to, they certainly don't have time to do any self-reflection, and they have less time to even meet with people, which sometimes might be welcome, to be fair, for the families. But if you're going to be doing work that's sort of outside of the box, you need time to do that. And so while there's all this, I mean, the talk Jane Addams do, Mary Richmond, right? I mean, it's like a perfect example of that, right? We're going to have this anti-oppression roundtable, and then we're going to make you, we're going to have this new computer system where if you don't put your reports in within 24 hours, you get dinged and your supervisors are going to put you under probation or whatever, right? So that was not a very hopeful thing. I do think it makes a difference, though. I actually do really believe that how people show up with one another, even in violent settings, can make an enormous difference, right? And I don't remember the name of the organization that the money's going to, but thank you for finding that. It sounds
Velma's House.
Velma's House, yeah. I mean, I think the stuff that's being done in harm reduction sites, in a lot of like low barrier social services, is really, really, really beautiful and important. And often it's not people with social work degrees who are necessarily doing that. It's people who have their own experiences, sex workers and drug users and so on. So I think that's something important for us to think about too as social work educators, right?
So I have a question from somebody online.
Yes.
They would be interested in your thoughts on anti-capitalist social workers, such as Bessie Tuzel in Canada or Bertha Chapman Reynolds in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, people, yeah, I'm gonna lie, I'm not gonna lie to say that I know a whole lot, but there were really important movements throughout this time. I know a little bit about Bertha Chapman Reynolds, and they were doing really important work. They also got like shut down for doing that work, and I think that's important too. But I do think it's, I'll talk about Angela Davis again, and also just to say that the clips were from an online lecture called How Does Change Happen? It's like my favorite teaching tool. It's brilliant. And one of the things she says in it is we do need to celebrate the victories that we have, but we also need to recognize that there's very often a big gap between what we achieve and what we were hoping for. And I think that's true of kind of all of the left movements that have happened in social work. I do think they make a difference. I think it's worth continuing to try to make social work better, or something, or to make the relationships with people who are struggling better. I'm not always sure we should hold on to social work in order to make that happen. That's a whole other question. But even if social work didn't exist anymore, there would still be people who need stuff, right? And I think that this ethic that we're talking about exists less maybe, but to some extent in any place of helping, right? So anyway, yeah, Bertha Chapman Reynolds and the other person whose name I'm not familiar with, we're really, it's really important. It's really important for us to know that there are these histories of struggle that go back, yeah. And Jane Addams was Jane Addams, I don't hate Jane Addams. Jane Addams did really, really interesting things. Her book, Democracy and Social Ethics, is like really interesting to read. Anyway, whatever, yeah.
So another question from somebody who was on the Zoom call. Can you point us towards some more of the directions of stories, imaging of how social workers can be possibilities?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think, well, for one thing, what I didn't ask at the very beginning was, is there anyone in this room who had contact with social workers or knew of contact with social workers that were helpful? Because that, of course, that happens too. The problem is we all know that already, right? But it is good to remember and to, it's hard to know sometimes what I have any faith in at all, but one of the things I do have faith in, if we can really stay good at it and, again, like sort of stretch our muscles, is being accountable and really trying to listen really hard and carefully to people in terms of how we're actually affecting them. And sometimes that can be really simple, right? If you're having some sort of a supportive conversation with someone to say like, is this what you want to be talking about? You know, and if they say no, then don't keep talking about budgeting or whatever. Yeah, so I think that when people talk about people who have really helped them in their lives, whether they were called social workers or aunties or teachers or whatever else, my sense is that often people talk about things like, you know, warmth and like being a really good listener. Also things like systems navigation, knowing things that, you know, it's hard to apply for social assistance. It's hard to figure out where to get a meal if you find yourself unhoused at 13 years old or 33 years old. So systems navigation stuff can be really helpful, especially if you can help people not to have to jump through so many hoops to get stuff that, of course, we should all be entitled to. Yeah, I don't know. Did that kind of answer?
Is there any other questions in the room, online? Okay. Well, we want to thank Chris with a small gift from the Faculty of Social Work. And thank you for coming all the way from Toronto to spend the day with us. Chris is going to be around for a few minutes, so if people would like to have an opportunity to talk to him individually, they can. On your way out, we invite you to take a little gift from the basket. We have an 80th anniversary of the Faculty of Social Work USB stick for everybody who came out in person today. All right, so thank you.
Thank you, everybody.